Hello and welcome to On Preachy, a podcast of homilies and reflections by the voices of St. John Chrysostom Parish. Today, Father Brian Zumbrum reflects on Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40, the Gospel for Sunday, October 29th, 2023.
So last week, I had one of the proudest moments of my career in education. A former student invited me to see his apartment for the first time, to show me the realization of a dream that we have been talking about for years. And as we stood there, surrounded by newly purchased pots and pans, he began to cry. "Thank you," he whispered, "for always loving me, even when I stopped loving myself." Love, a word we toss around so easily, and one of which I am particularly fond, repeating it often, to family and friends, to students and grads and colleagues. But when that former student said thank you, I couldn't help but think back on our journey together over the past decade. And I realized that being true to my word, to love him, was certainly harder at certain points in his life than others. See, it was easy to love him in that apartment when all the fruits of his work and sacrifices were coming to fruition. But it was much harder to love him when he was making decisions that perplexed me, or frightened me, or overwhelmed me. It was much harder to love him when he tried to freeze me out, when he wouldn't return calls or avoided answering the door. And it was much harder to love him when he was in the darkest points in his depression, when he was so low that I questioned if anyone could still reach him. And as I pondered all of this anew this week, I kept returning to this gospel, the two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But what if that second part is the key to it all? What if our love for one another can only be as true as the love we have for ourselves? And suddenly I began to realize why love gets more difficult for me at times. Because the truth is, I am much more stingy with my love for myself than anyone else. Sure, it's easy to love myself when I'm successful and well-liked. It's easy to love myself when I make all the right choices. But it's a lot harder to love me when I'm exhausted or burnt out or frustrated. It's a lot harder to love myself when I'm insecure or frightened or foolish. And it is a lot harder to love myself when I feel like a mess, a broken, busted version of myself. Is it any wonder that I found it hard to love in another what I've struggled my whole life to love in myself? My friends, I believe that this gospel is such a profound summation of our call as a Christian people. But it is also so incredibly challenging to how we see ourselves. For how we love ourselves will be the measure by which we love the world around us. Will we be our own harshest critics, berating, belittling, pointing out our every flaw and blemish and error? Will we be afraid of our own potential or our past, of the shadows within us, of our own weakness? Will our love for ourselves be conditional, depending on how we perform, how we look, how others perceive us? Or will we allow our love for ourselves to be generous, embracing all parts of us, extending grace and mercy to heal all those pieces within ourselves that still wound us or disappoint us or trouble us? Will our love for ourselves be gentle and compassionate, taking us where we are in this moment and loving us into the next moment, the next chapter, the next horizon? For as we learn to truly love ourselves as God loves us, we will find that our love for our neighbor is transformed. We will discover we're no longer threatened or afraid of the other, or their weaknesses that so uncomfortably mirror our own. We will no longer need to pass judgment or demand that people become some idealized versions of themselves before we will love them. Instead, we can love them as they are, the complicated, beautiful, messy, divine creations that each and every human being is. Because we will discover that we too are those same magnificent, flawed, divine creations ourselves. And in so doing, we may just encounter anew this God in whose image we are made, reflected in the face of our neighbor and reflected in the mirror that we gaze upon each night. May God be praised.
Unpreachy is a production of St. John Chrysostom Parish in Wallingford, Pennsylvania. Visit us at sjcparish.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. This podcast was produced by Brendan Lorden with music by Skytoes on Upbeat. Thanks for listening. Be well.